What is bothering Trump? The trade deficit, and it bothers him because he's a mercantilist and he thinks that foreigners are engaged in all kinds of nefarious activities that basically screw the United States and cause us to import more than we export and have a trade deficit. It's all complete rubbish. The deficit is created in the good old USA. We have a deficiency of savings in the United States relative to investment, and as a result, that deficiency or gap between savings and investment, it gets filled in by foreigners who fortunately are standing by to fill the gap. And fortunately, the U.S. can easily finance that trade deficit, so you end up with the American consumer benefiting. We're consuming a lot more than would be the case if, in fact, foreign exporters weren't exporting things into the United States to fill the savings deficiency gap. So the first point is trade imbalances are created domestically. China has a huge surplus in its current account and its trade account, its international dealings. And the reason for that is that they have a huge surplus of savings that are much greater than the investments that occur inside China. So by definition, they will have a trade surplus. Same with Japan. Same with Switzerland. Same with Germany. We happen to have a big deficiency. Since 1975, we've always had a trade deficit. And most of that savings deficiency, by the way, all of it is accounted for by the fact that we have a deficiency in the federal accounts and state and local government too. If you add state and local government and the federal together, the savings in those public sector activities is much less than the investment that's occurring in the public sector. And as a result, you've got what's called a fiscal deficit. And the fiscal deficit really is what generates the trade deficit. The trade deficit is exactly equal to the fiscal deficit in the United States. If Trump thought that the trade deficit was a problem, and he does, by the way, I don't think it's a problem. Most economists wouldn't think it's a problem. But how do you solve that? If you balance the budget, the trade deficit is going to go away. The money supply calls the tune of the economy, and big changes in the money supply with a lag eventually work their way into the real economy, the thing that you've got up there from the nowcast, as well as inflation. And I'm not surprised. I've been anticipating that this going off the cliff would have happened before. The lag has been very long this time. We have a stock of the money supply now that's actually less than it was in June of 2022. So the money supply has contracted. That kind of big contraction has only occurred 4 times in the history of the Fed since 1913. And each one of those has been followed by either a depression, the 1929-33 contraction of the money supply by 38%, or in the other 3 cases, just a garden variety recession. And that's why I have kept saying that a slowdown and recession, those things are baked in the cake because what happened a couple of years ago to the money supply. So it's basically confirming finally what I've been anticipating for some time. I've said we're going to have a recession. It looks like it's going to start happening early in this year. The headline numbers in the job market and in manufacturing might not look that bad or look okay, but if you look under the hood, they don't look so great. And by the way, the manufacturing sector has been more or less slowing down for quite some time. The labor market, you've really got to look at the details of what's going on. The headline stuff doesn't look all that bad, but if you look at the details, it looks a little bit more grim in the labor market, which would probably surprise most people. If you look at the budget that just came out of the House, you had Speaker Johnson sitting right behind President Trump, and they just have passed a budget that's increasing government spending. So all this hoopla about Elon Musk and cutting waste, fraud, and abuse, that's fine, and I think most Americans are all for it, but what's the House done? It's just passed a budget. They're spending more money in defense. I thought we wanted to go in and cut defense. So these speeches that these politicians are giving, there's a lot of jingoism involved here. There are a lot of quibbles that I have. Let's put it that way. See, he has little contradictions in there. He got the money supply in there, and that's the key. And if the money supply is under control, he put it in a way that I wouldn't formulate it quite that way. He said, if the output of the economy is growing faster than the money supply, obviously inflation is going to be tamed. But at any rate, it's the money supply. So he got the money supply in there, but then he starts tangling it up with the waste, fraud, and abuse and all these other things. Basically, if the money supply is not growing, it isn't faster than the rate of growth in the economy. You have to grow the money supply faster than the rate of growth in the economy because the demand for money goes up. The economy is only growing at about 2%, and the demand for money is growing about 2%, and the inflation target's 2%. 2 plus 2 plus 2 is 6. That's Hanke's golden growth rate for the money supply. But at any rate, he's kind of on the right track, shall we say. But if you control inflation, then the interest rates come down. So there's a three-step process that's a lot simpler to explain than some of the things that Musk was talking about. One, get the money supply growing at Hanke's golden growth rate that's consistent with the inflation target of 2%. That's about 6%. Then inflation is going to come in around 2% or a little below 2%. When that happens, that's the second step. Third step, yields on bonds always follow what's going on in inflation. And the bond yield, Trump mentioned this in his speech, the 10-year bond yield has been coming down the last 10 days or so. Why? Because the inflation numbers start looking better and better all the time. Even now, we've got some headroom. I'd have no problem, by the way, I'm saying as a trade, I think the 10 years still looking pretty good. And in light of the fact that you have this Atlanta Fed now forecast of a slump in the economy, Hanke's agreeing with that. What's the background? We have the money supply contraction a couple of years ago. That is working its way into the economy. The economy is going to slow down. Inflation will keep slowing down. And Trump is throwing so many curveballs into the picture with this trade war thing that it throws a lot of uncertainty into the picture and it undermines confidence. And if confidence is undermined, that just conflates the thing. It makes it even worse. All of those things lead into a pretty good bond trade being long. The whole idea of this agreement is kind of a little bit murky because a lot of the minerals we're talking about are in the 4 eastern Donbass regions that are occupied by the Russians, not the Ukrainians. And any peace deal, by the way, or ceasefire, whichever way you want to call it, is not going to occur if the Russians leave those areas. The Russians have strict conditions, and Trump understands these perfectly. One is that they're not leaving Crimea, and they're also not leaving the 4 Donbass that they occupy. Point number 2 is that there will be no peacekeeping Western NATO peacekeeping troops in Ukraine, and there will not be any NATO membership in Ukraine. That's also in stone. So that's why I say signing an agreement for what? We have a big problem. We have the Europeans want to go to war with Russia, and Trump does not want to go to war with Russia. So the whole meeting after the Zelensky affair in the White House, there was a Sunday meeting in London where the President Macron and Prime Minister of Great Britain led the troops, and it was basically an anti-U.S. meeting. And it was a war meeting. But there's a little problem. The West can't go to war with Russia unless the U.S. provides cover. The whole reason we've had this war going on, dragging on for 3 years in Ukraine, is because the U.S. has supplied a lot of money, a lot of weaponry, a lot of intelligence, and a lot of satellite facilitation and things like that. Europeans have no army, and they're broke. They can't finance a war. If Trump cuts these things off, which he's temporarily doing, this thing is going to wind down pretty fast. He needs to continue to open up the negotiation with, in particular, before Putin, you've got Foreign Secretary Lavrov and been in contact. You know, he was in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, first initial meetings. So they have to form a contact group. I mean, they have to get their embassies functioning again. Biden never talked to Putin. So you have to start talking to each other. We're at the very preliminary stages. The idea that Trump has that he can just shut this thing down with a click of a switch is fanciful. It's not going to happen. But it's moving in the right direction. There look like with Lavrov and Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State of the United States, has looked like they're moving forward so they can make contact, start deliberations. And we know what the elements of the deliberations are. The Russians are essentially going to say, you're going to have to make Ukraine like Austria was made after the Second World War, a neutral country that can't be a member of NATO, and they're neutral. That's going to be one of the preconditions. The other thing is a geographic territory that the Russians have already taken. People don't realize they've won the war. When somebody wins a war, you don't come in and tell the victor what to do. The victor tells you what to do. The reason the war started in the first place was a provocation by the West of inviting Ukraine into NATO, into the Western Alliance. Unfortunately, when the Warsaw Pact was dissolved, they should have dissolved NATO. Then we wouldn't have this war.